We will now begin the session, The European Union at 60. Professor Federico Romero, Professor of History of Post-War European Cooperation and Integration in the Department of History and Civilization at the EUI, will chair the session. Our distinguished participants include Roberto Gualtieri, Member of the European Parliament and Chair of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. We have Irini Karamuzzi, Lecturer in Contemporary History at the University of Sheffield, Alina Mungiu, PPD, Professor of Democracy Studies at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, and Tibor Navracic, European Commissioner for Education, Culture, Youth and Sport.
Thank you very much. One would think on the Treaty of Rome 60th anniversary that the best advertisement for the EU would simply be a straight comparison with the previous 60 years of European history. Several speakers recalled this already, and it doesn't take a very deep historical awareness to understand that there is simply no match between the prosperity, safety, freedom under the EC and then EU and the misery Europeans suffered in the first half of the 20th century. And yet, we are well aware that this self-evident truth has little traction today. Most Europeans presume that the continent's tragedies belong to a distant and unrepeatable past, or they simply ignore this kind of metrics, as we all live in the present with anxieties and concerns focused on the future. So rather than compare the record of nationalism and authoritarianism with the achievements of European cooperation, large groups of voters concentrate on their present-day insecurities, vulnerabilities. Many identify with narratives that construct distant elites privileged by the dynamics of market globalization with bottom-up claims for closer democratic control at the national or local level. Not a few seem even prepared to ditch the liberal universe of rights and institutional safeguards and to embrace nativist exclusionary notions of society with scapegoat groups variously identified by race, religion, status. So the paradoxical challenge of this anniversary is to re-engage in a vital cultural and political contest against the authoritarian nationalism that post-war Europe appeared to have conquered and that the Treaty of Rome philosophy in particular had dislodged 60 years ago. It is a sad, but perhaps also salutary reminder that progress is never linear, much less granted once and for all. It is also a call to reconsider not only what the European Community, European Union did right, but what it failed to do, and the ways in which it nurtured the frustrated discontent that now challenges it. This is a reassessment that could embrace many fields, from economics to law, from foreign policy to social issues, and I'm sure our guest speakers will touch upon various sides of the visions, achievement, and unfulfilled promises of the European Community, European Union long history. So let's start from the origins and consider first the ways in which the European Community, European Union has fulfilled or did not fulfill the key goals set at its foundation. Roberto.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you to the EU for the invitation. Undoubtedly, if we start with the first phase, let's call it the community phase up to Maastricht. Of course, there are a number of sub-phases, but to be simple, we can say that it has indeed really strongly delivered in terms of the goals that were set in the basic documents of the treaties, prosperity, peace, democracy. How and why? In essence, we can talk about an extraordinary, let's say, triple compromise: political, economic, and institutional, political, Franco-German, and broader reconciliation, economic, the scope, common market and social market economy, and institutional in the feature and instrument, the so-called community system. Of course, this triple compromise worked. If we want to understand why it worked, we have to put it in a broader context, which is bipolarism, the cooperative hegemony of the US, including and in particular in the economic and monetary field with the Bretton Woods system and its gradual phasing in. But the originality of the European construction and the political will and bond that which was behind it have been decisive for its capacity to deliver. In this context, indeed, the community system has been a fantastic invention, which has allowed since the beginning this construction to go beyond international cooperation and has introduced significant element of federal integration, also with the famous rulings of the Court of Justice. We know that, the supremacy, direct effect of your law, etc. But what is important, the point I would like to make is this integration by law should not be seen, in my opinion, in a tension, necessarily in a contradiction with the capacity that European integration had in the first phase to contribute to the development of a welfare state of social market economy. I owe to Philippe Van Pieris a reference to the very, very interesting essay of Frederick von Hayek of 1939, The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism, where his prediction was that good integration of sovereign nation states that would gradually reduce the possibility of transfer within the member state, but would make very difficult the transfer among member states. So very good that would destroy capacity of state to regulate the economy or to burden it with an expensive welfare state. I have to say that the first phase proved to be quite the contrary, because this integration by law, common market integration have been instrumental for recasting and developing the social market economy, not simply in a distribution of tasks. The common market creates growth and the nation state redistributed. But I would say in a more complex and sophisticated interaction of national and European policies and instruments. So I would say that the very strong connection that one can read in the Rome Treaty first pages between common market and four freedoms is not just a rhetorical concession. It is a fundamental feature of the European construction. Then we know from the 70s and then after Maastricht, this positive connection has entered into tension. And then we will try to see whether this means that the, let's say, Hayek prediction was right or that it is not right, as I think.
Thank you. Irene, what's your take on origins? It's not working. Can we have the mic working or?
Yes. It's working? I think it's working
Okay.
now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Federico, for the invitation and EUI. As a historian of European integration, I think if you think about the key goals of EC, European Community, and what turned out to be EU, of course, peace features predominantly, but we have to remember how that was accomplished. Europe was divided. Peace was in a way guaranteed by the creation of NATO and the sense of an Atlantic cocoon being created. And also in post-45, European Community and the EU could really rely on a sense of Western dominance in terms of international trade or technology or even where the power politics really laid with the help of the hegemonic United States. But I think the second goal, which is very important, is what the European integration really achieved, I think, is the European rescue of the nation state. Ultimately, the European Community was conceived as an anti-hegemonic, not as anti-national establishment. And I think in those rights, it was really successful. It gave the two countries, which are considered the motor of European integration, either is France or Germany, a reason to pull part of the sovereignty because it met substantial national interests. For France, it was one way of controlling the dominance of Germany, but also the Germans really wanted and had to show European commitment. They wanted to because they wanted to part ways with their pre-45 history, but also they had to because it was the only way to achieve what was the goal in post-war Europe, which was the unification of Germany. So I think in those rights, we are talking much more about rescuing the nation state than actually putting it on the side. And the third aspect I want to talk about is the so-called and proclaimed prosperity. For many years, that was achieved, but not because the European community or the EU was promoting globalization. Actually, it was fending off the interruptions of globalization. In a way, the European community was the embodiment of post-war consensus, what we call embedded liberalism. You open up the markets, you learn the mistakes of the interwar period, you try to revert from protectionist tendencies, but at the same time, you make sure that the state is there to protect through welfare, jobs, and social and cultural security. Of course, that changes, and we'll discuss that, but I think that's were clear achievements that were produced through the EC.
Thank you. Alina, what's your take on origins?
Well, I'd say that in order to evaluate a project, we should return not to its objectives as we perceive them now, but exactly as their founders have them in mind. And I think the founders of this project were realistic founders. I never anywhere read in Jean Monnet that he really hoped that he's going to go beyond the nation states. He only hoped that by pooling resources, he's going to solve better joint problems of different states, and this is what he fought for. I have never seen in any of the founders any sort of megalomaniac reference that the creation of European community, or even, as they hoped, of a more advanced form of union in the future, is somewhat an end of history. No, they were simply creating a pragmatic instrument to cope with history better. They never thought of you as an end in itself, but as an instrument to prevent crises of the ones that they have just experienced in their own lives recently, and they knew that national sovereignty alone was not able to handle such crises. And I think they were rather successful in this modest endeavor, which turned out not to be that modest, into really avoiding quite a significant number of continental and intracontinental conflicts that are now forgotten, and in the process in creating an international, not only European, but an international regimes of norms, of protecting the weak, of protecting minorities, of protecting the women, which, to be honest, I consider a greater realization of Europe and what Europe stands for in the world than even our market realizations. For this, we should have to do counterfactuals with countries which were similar in culture and were not part of our common market, to look how, I don't know, Australia or New Zealand have done in similar times, and I don't think they've done badly. But what we have achieved and is unique, and this is why I was fairly upset when I heard Mrs. May saying that the first thing that she wants to drop is the European Convention of Human Rights. And you must have a truly British human rights law and not a universal one. Because if countries which actually invented human rights and managed to universalize it, denounce it in their way, what are we going to tell Mr. Putin? What are we going to tell, I don't know, what other dictator in a poor country of the world? So I think that this regime of standards, rule of law, respect, and treating, offering protection to the weak, it's our proudest achievement, and this is why, you know, whatever happened afterwards, I also felt quite proud of Mrs. Merkel on her stand during the refugees, whatever happened the next day.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Navracsics.
I think it was differentiating various levels of the original goals, because there are obviously strategic goals in the Rome Treaty, the ever closer union, for instance, peace, prosperity, and there are policy goals, the single market project or the common agricultural policy. And I think if we evaluate the progress we've been made so far, it's a huge success in strategy goals in certain aspects. For instance, the emancipatory role of the European integration as a huge success. The enlargements, for instance, which is a very strong contributor to the stabilization of the continent, the political and economic stabilization of the continent. The southern enlargement, the eastern enlargement is really a very, very important historical fact. On the other hand, we are now facing some of the backlashes of the implementation of policy goals, the single market project, the euro crisis, the crisis in agricultural policy, which can be led back to my original problem of the European project. Because if we broaden the lifespan of the European idea, and we are not concentrating exclusively on the 60 years which we've been living since the Rome Treaty, there is a neglected aspect of the European integration. That's the cultural aspect. Culture in a broader terms, which involves education, sport, all the community issues, I would say. And if we go back to Coudenhove-Kalergi, for instance, or for Robert Schuman, they knew that without culture, without a community based on culture, the European integration has no real chances for survival. And I think in these days, we're just facing those problems and those aspects which are rooted in the lack of a larger community in culture. I'm not talking about federalization of culture or education or sports policies. I'm talking about a very flexible, opening up a flexible area of cultural interactions, bringing closer European cultural traditions, diverse traditions, and a better understanding of our diversity. I think that's the point where the European integration has failed so far, but we have to correct it.
Thank you very much. Now, 60 years is not a short period of time. A lot of things have changed. And of course, the European Community Union has, to a certain extent, adapted to these transformations and promoted transformation of its own. So the question comes, if the original, in a way, mission and nature of the EC has changed substantially along the way, is the EU of today a different animal from its origins or not? Roberto.
Partially it is, and clearly the decisive turning point is Maastricht. Behind Maastricht there are basically two events, Bretton Woods system collapse and end of cooperative hegemony of the US, and then from 89 to 91, end of bipolarism, German unification. The first event made the euro needed, the second made it both necessary and possible. So with Maastricht, while there was a process in parallel overlapping of moving ahead the common market to single market, Schengen, enlargement, but then with Maastricht on top of that, we have also the extension of the European integration to areas which are at the heart of national sovereignty, the currency, economic policy, and then we have foreign policy, liberty, justice, security. And the issue, the point is unavoidably, I would say, while this common single market process was strongly embedded into the community system, this second process was a bit an hybrid, as Sergio Fabbrini pointed out very clearly, communitarian but intergovernmental, and within that this asymmetry between monetary policy as an exclusive competence of the Union, economic policy as a decentralized competence of member state, supposedly within a set of rules, and then a number of very strong safeguards, no bailout rule, no monetary financing, unanimity for the budget. That was a budget for the single market, not a budget for the single currency. So this, of course, made this construction of the EMU very strong, necessary to protect, but also fragile. And the crisis showed how this construction was fragile. But then, I have to say, notwithstanding these weaknesses and also a lot of political mistakes, the crisis has shown also a significant resilience and flexibility of the European construction. So we found legal basis to provide financial assistance, so not truly no bailout, but bailout with conditionality, monetary financing, whatever it takes from the ECB. So a number of, and then toughening of financial regulation, the banking union. So a number of measures that made the construction sufficiently resilient not to collapse, but still not sufficiently strong to perfectly function, and to deny the Hayek prediction, because that's what's happened in these years, that some say, no, that he was right. Actually, this is in contradiction with social market economy, with the welfare state. This construction cannot provide a sufficient level of transfers, basically, that allow our social model to survive in the globalized world. Here, I mean, one part of the problem is more about policies than about institutions. We should not forget that. Within this institution, as said, different policies are possible, and the shift from the previous commission to this commission is showing that. This commission far more wiser, it's called flexibility. We can be less procyclical, so less tough on national budget and so on. But then there is also an issue of construction, and this is probably for the third round, what we need for the future to prove that Van Hayek is wrong.
Thank you. Irene, you're a scholar of enlargement. So the community grew but changed as well, or?
Yeah, the community definitely grew, but its mission also changed, and I think that's what's interesting when we forget about enlargement. The major goal in the founding members was about peace and prosperity. There was no mention of democracy. It was not even considered as a notion when Schuman and Monnet were coming up with the plans. And what is interesting is when the Southern European dictatorship collapsed in the 1970s, and they started knocking on the door of Europe, equating Europe with democracy. Of course, there were no mechanics in place. But Europe suddenly discovered through the applicants, and that's what is interesting, they did not come up with a blueprint. The applicants themselves made Europe as an anchor of democracy. In a way, acceding to the European community meant that it would be a guarantee for democratic institutions. And I think that was so successful. I mean, and Alina is right, if you look in the 70s and the 80s, that when Eastern Europe and the fall of the wall came about, they in a way took over the same rhetoric from the Southern Europeans and mobilized along the same ways. This time the EU was much more prepared, of course. They had learned in a way from the mistakes of Southern Europe, and they had a set of conditionalities that came about. And this is an ongoing exercise. I find that the EU, if you're a historian of European integration, you really understand that it's a trial and error process. And of course, errors can be sometimes detrimental, but also there's an immense effort in trying to adapt to the different contexts. I think another way that the EU has not changed, though, unfortunately, is this blind belief in the Monnet method. That in a way, if you allow for some kind of functional integration, that spillover will automatically mean more political integration. And we see the limits of this approach now. And I think already that started. I mean, the major turning point, and I agree with Roberto, is the 1970s. The moment that this age of fracture, the collapse of the Bretton Woods, and the tarnishment of national welfare, the EU, the EC at the time, stops being, in a way, a protector of the interruption of globalization and becomes an enforcer of globalization by tapping into schemes like the single market and the euro, which were, of course, were politically imperative, and there were many other reasons behind that I won't go into, but definitely meant that suddenly economic integration moved much further than political integration, and suddenly you had an imbalance between the political and the economic legs of European integration. I think that's the challenges we're facing, how you're going to compromise that when 1 out of 5 Europeans do not want to move more control from their national capitals to Brussels.
Alina.
Well, I would say again that Europe was conceived as an instrument to solve problems, and as well as it was treated under this instrumental aspect, and this is how people still perceive it, highly instrumentally. You know, I once spent 3 days with other academics in Brussels, judging applications under a really unhappy terms of reference launched by DG Research, which was called How to Create European Identity, using Brussels flag, Brussels hymn, and I don't know what. And we were giving away millions of money to someone to come with this miracle solution. And this is 5 years ago, right? In the same time, I was watching in my hotel at the reception how people from Franz Bloch were singing in the Belgian parliament, dressed in some 19th century outfit, only they know what. So I simply realized that not even in the capital of Belgium had we managed to eradicate a nation state and to create a European identity. But this was not part of the initial objective, so I think that Europe started losing effectiveness in the moment when it became an end in itself, and in the moment when it started creating instruments for this end in itself. And Euro, unfortunately, is a part of this. For Europe to be effective, even under the original design, it would also have needed convergence to succeed. And Europe went fairly well as long as convergence progressed along. But Euro being such a demanding instrument, we actually had a repetition in Germany, right? We had seen how the Deutsche Mark had worked when the German reunification took place between the East and the West. The East was entirely swept out. You know, common currencies are not convergence instruments. They will take out differences in competitiveness. They will not attenuate them, and in any way they will not address them, right? And this is what we are doing now, and we have been doing for a while, patching an attempt which is very difficult to succeed, seeing the differences in governance across the continent, the way the continent looks presently. And that I think we should contemplate, because that's not going to go away. We had become a few years ago extraordinarily arrogant in believing that we can change countries top down. I heard a lot of that. And this is what I work about as a scholar in changing governance. I look at the 110 countries outside Europe where EU gives a lot of money. I look at European countries and I look at Italy. As a young woman, I was very impressed by an article by Commissioner Monti. He was Commissioner of Competition, I think, for the time, who wrote that Italy must necessarily join the euro, so it was before, because otherwise, by itself, Italians will never find the discipline to rationalize fiscal spending and their own government. And I read this, and it was like on my own country, my own original country being Romania. And I said, yes, we must also absolutely join EU, we must absolutely join Euro and, become more rational. And I've seen some figures from an institute called Demos in Rome two weeks ago. And apparently for the last 10 years, only about 11% on the average of Italians consider that Italy has better governance now than before Mani Pulite. And if I look at my own country, and at Italy, I think Italy is the future of Romania. I don't think we're going to get better than this. And of course, we're not going to get Italy's past, which is, yours to share. So you don't really change governance with European instruments. If countries which had been in the oldest, most of the time, who had enlightened elites, someone like Monti, who had a project of transformation of the country using external incentives, and Italy didn't change, Greece didn't change, the first generation of East European countries, I can tell you that they didn't change. Those who are doing very well, like Estonia, they did very well from before joining EU. They had the domestic agency, because that's what it really matters. From before, they were more liberal than the European average country, and this is why they did so well. This is why so bravely embraced the euro and all this. So we have to be a little bit more modest. And in the 110 countries that I survey, where we give money for over 10 years, I have just the simple descriptive thing. I have a list with 10 countries which changed most in governance, which are very small changes anyway, because this is the most difficult thing to change, the way you operate your government. And 10 countries with the top EU receiving list, and there's not one country on the same two lists, right? And which is not surprising, because the country to whom we give most money for rule of law is Turkey, the country to whom we give most money for anti-corruption is Ukraine, and a lot. So the thing is, we work fabulously as an insidious agent of change. Our Europeanization through contiguity is what works fantastically. Slovenia transformed by Carinthia next door, and Estonia transformed by Finland, and by sort of direct thing, not through this top-down imposition, even with treaty, even with conditionality, and with showing people things. This doesn't work for ourselves. And I think we should sort of reconsider what we can realistically do and learn from what worked in the past, but also from what did not work.
Thank you. Commissioner Navracic.
Just to continue, I think the original principal mission is the same, but the details are always changing. Just because we become smarter or more experienced during this process. In my reading, this 60 years is about a very simple or logical assumption, neo-functionalist assumption, that if we start a strong, close cooperation in one area, it will spill over to other areas as well. So there will be an automatic or almost automatic process of integration in every areas of the life. And our learning process is the realization that it's not so easy. We have to launch auxiliary projects to underpin the original mission. I think the first shock was the politics of empty chairs in the mid-60s, that national interest couldn't be superseded so easily. The other one is the Eurosclerosis period in the late 70s, and then the restart of the 80s. Just imagine the 80s gave us not only the Single European Act, not only for the project of social Europe, not only the Single Market project, but also the European Capital of Cultures, the Erasmus. Those are very important projects which were launched in the 80s. And the enlargements, again, a very important revelation that geographically, if we want to have successful in economic integration, we have to broaden the geographical appeal. We have to make an economically stable continent. So I think the fundamental mission is the same, but we've been enriched by the experiences and by all the assumptions which made the original mission very complex, and we have to face now the consequences of that complexity.
Thank you. Well, I would like to move at this point to our current problems and hear what you think of the resources that its own history gave to the EU in order to respond with effectiveness to the challenges emerging from both the transformations within European society and transformations in the global context. Do we have the resources, intellectual, institutional, political, to face up to these challenges, and in which ways? Again, Roberto.
The challenge is very complex, very difficult. I think we do have the resources. First, we have a very strong underlying political bond, which has been weakened, put into tension. We know the political dynamic in member states, but still is a source of strength that should never be underestimated. And so many predictions I read on Financial Times, okay, if in 1 week Europe does not do that, will be no more euro area, no more. So this is not true, because at the end, too late always, but it emerged this element. So this is a resource. And we have a mechanism, a construction, in the economic area, because I have not much time, that can have inside some element of flexibility and can also evolve in a way which not necessarily require the federal leap, the full-fledged treaty change, the full-fledged fiscal union, and so on, which we know is something that is not realistic in the short term, even if for me it remains a goal in a medium long term. So we have a possibility to have an incremental, for instance, completion of the economic monetary union in the framework also on a correction on the main driver of economic policy, which have occurred also partially these years. And this happened also thanks to a dynamic which is an internal dynamic of the Lisbon framework, a political one. This commission has been the first political commission. We had the Spitzencandidate. We have a new process of negotiation between European political families for the program of the commission, and some political groups said, okay, we want Juncker because he won, but if you want our vote, you need to put flexibility, an investment plan, policies for migration, and then all compromises, everything a bit imperfect. But we have Werner Hoyer here. Juncker plan is working, is not enough, is not sufficient, but is working. Flexibility is providing a more balanced, a less pro-cyclical fiscal policy, and we are performing not so bad currently now. Last data show that. Of course, this is insufficient, and the problem is how we move forward with it, using the means that we have. So what I would say is we can have a role. We as a parliament contributed to this. I see Mercedes Bresso was one of the rapporteurs. We define a roadmap which is realistic, is ambitious but realistic. We can have a convergence code to incentive economic policy convergence between member states with a kind of Maastricht criteria, and distinguish between the goal and the mean. The mean is for national politics, the goal is decided at the European level, and as a trade-off, building up within the EU budget, so differentiated integration, but within the structure of the community of the union law, a fiscal capacity that can provide some shock absorption function, can provide an unemployment benefit scheme, then we can integrate the ESM within the union framework. So we are not so far from a construction we can be more solid, more sound, more capacity to able to reconcile economic policy convergence, a good fiscal policy, and also capacity to provide social and territorial cohesion, which are the three things that should be interconnected, that have been interconnected in the first phase via a different distribution of tasks between a union and member state, but now I think can be reconnected also currently with the instrument we have. Of course, the main driver, the fundamental driver, is a political dimension. We cannot have an artificial separation. I agree that the logic, the theory of external constraints, the external constraints of EU rules will by definition improve the quality of national politics or national governance. This does not work. It has to be a political process. And we have to incentivize the interconnection between national politics and European politics, political families, relations between members of European Parliament and members of national parliaments, meeting of political families before the European Council where the two institutions cooperate, agendas. So it's a process, it's complex, it's difficult, but I bet that the next European election will see far more attention to the choice of member of European Parliament, because now we have more power and some part of society understand that it's important who goes there, what they do. And so we will gradually have also a stronger politicization of this dynamic, which I think is the condition for making this incremental process working, and also overcoming the main issue of trust, of lack of trust, that currently makes very difficult to even talk of any kind of risk sharing, of mutualization, and so on. I think it's a process, it's difficult, but it's possible.
Irene, are you similarly confident?
As a historian, probably tend to be more pessimistic. I think the idea that voters will suddenly turn against protectionism and populist on their own right, it's more of a cosmopolitan wishful thinking. I think there is a solution that has to be found first at the national level in terms of addressing this, that, you know, advocating liberal market economies and this revolution of technology will leave some part of the population worse off. And the question is how you're going to turn this economic efficiency into a benefit for those people who are feeling the disruptions of this double kind of liberalism, whether it's social or economic. But the process of European integration, if we want to be, as Elena said, pragmatic, has been really slow process. That has been realistically the scenario, which means that we cannot predict what path it will take because most of the relaunches or sclerosis were actually a result of a myriad of factors at national level interacting with international forces as well. So I think kind of thinking about the political contingency gives you a better framework on how you can think about the next day than federal theology, or what is worse, this Eurosceptic version of Brussels-based solutions. So in a way, muddling through is not a bad policy for some time. History has shown that survival mode can carry you for several time. Now, if that will erupt into a crisis, I don't know that. But I think what is interesting about our times is that EU is part of a bigger question, which I think, are we enduring now a small, in a way, a pause in the bigger narrative of the great convergence? We have to make our minds what stories about this globalization story we've been telling for the last, mainly, well, post-45 hyper-globalization since the 1980s. So in a way, the kind of story that we tell, I think, will pose the bigger question. And what do I mean by that? How are you going to win over public sentiment? Which version is going to pertain? Isn't that the globalist one or the one that returns back to the nation state and ends this elite-driven globalism? I think that will be much more important. History teaches that stories are powerful instruments for mobilizing public energies, for endorsing alternative visions. Therefore, the message has to be changed, but also the messenger has to change. It cannot just be the technocratic elite. That was sufficient enough while we were remembering the Second World War, and there was a Cold War to fight. We live in a post-war period where there's no such exigence, or the people do not feel related to these kind of stories. So the messenger also have to be much more active citizenship. Of course, this is another story I'm telling. It's much more complicated. It needs institutional, political, and social resolve, but also an acceptance of the primacy of the nation state. That doesn't mean a nationalistic fervor, but actually reallocating where the power of source should be emanating.
Thank you. Alina.
So in a small, wonderful book that I recommend to everybody, my very distinguished senior colleague, Professor Klaus Offe, the book is called Europe Entrapped, basically says we all ask what should be done. But actually the preliminary political economy question is who should do something? Who is the plausible coalition of people who now has the potential to reform Europe and make it fitter for survival? I mean, is it us? By us, I understand people who gained a lot from Europe so far and who are the rather thin European elite. Well, I'm not sure we are sufficient. Also, we seem to have a lot of feelings going on against us as main promoters of the system. Who is a winner? And we know from, from old research as well as new, that in public opinion surveys, people the most promoting of Europe are people, unfortunately, who stand to win more of Europe. The most educated, people with most transferable skills, and not the others. The others have never been, great enthusiasts. Can we go on with a system where only the winners are the promoters? Is this enough for times like this? Or should we try to forge better alliances? And seems to me clearly that the answer is the second. Also in terms of ideas and creativity, remember that Americans after September 11, they went to Hollywood and they hired some scriptwriters because nobody at Pentagon had ever, in their nightmares, had the idea of some, planes coming and hitting the world towers. And they said, we need some thinking totally out of the box for something worse that can happen. I think that this is what we should have done after Brexit. I've been in numerous scenario groups, and I can tell you that all of them are within the box. We cannot find solutions because we look at these solutions in a very restricted group. We don't even realize, in fact, how confined we are to a certain mental space, and we cannot go beyond this border. So alliance, let's see, who gets together. I think that's preliminary to anything. And as to real things to do, I would just offer 3 directions, but I'm not in the situation of doing any of this, for all their worth. First, I think we need a real PR, late as it is, for globalization in Europe. And this PR, if I looked at the list of the 10 first allocations on the Juncker plan, they didn't seem to me to be that. The first one went to the city of Gothenburg, which is one of the richest places in Europe, for Gothenburg kids to write books and organize a mega fair how to market their books. This is very, very nice, but I think we have more pressing groups who are going to some elections tomorrow and who need to be compensated today if they're not going to go to those elections with the precise goal of blowing all of us up here from the stage forever. And I think this is, late in understanding. This has to go through a different mechanism than our usual bureaucracy, who writes better projects and who has more money gets more money, or we are really lost because we live in democracies and voters obviously have ways of getting back to us. The second PR that we have to do is for ourselves. We are spending structural funds in a way that nobody really thanks us for this. I mean, I'm not a great believer in convergence, less and less if I look at the academic evidence. But think of all this money really like a publicity fund for us. Think that we could involve people from the planning. What is this money really for, instead of giving it to local elites and reinforcing exactly the elites that people complain about, to have a totally social accountability mechanism open for the funds until their audits. There has never been a negative evaluation of EU funds in places like Sicily or other places like this. If you look on paper, they've all been spent marvelously. Ask people there, have EU funds changed your life? And they tell no. But they could tell yes, and that would be a big, win PR-wise for us. But again, this is a radical revolution of the type we cannot conceive, because it means that the methodology by which we disperse these funds are different. We have to go to the people, or the people will go to someone else. I don't mention names, right, these days. And the third thing, we have to do some PR for elites. We are considered elites, we are considered establishment. We see this feeling growing day after day. Even before elections in the United States, there were 67% saying that everyone, elite and establishment, wants what is bad for the country and just good for themselves. It was enough to see this to realize that Trump will win, I won a bet with my Deutsche Bank banker. Said, no, there's no way someone from establishment will win with these public opinion figures. Do you know the figures in Europe? Do you know that in Europe we have 2/3 people saying in a Eurobarometer that it's connections and bribes which ensure success in Europe, both in the public and private sector? Don't tell me that people are paranoid. These are the people who vote, plus they're not entirely paranoid when connections are concerned. We have to fix this. The way to fix this is to simply get a Scandinavian lifestyle, because there are only 4 countries in Europe presently where people who are so paranoid are on the minorities, and these are the Scandinavian countries. Whatever they do, bare offices, politicians on bicycles, we have to copy and do it all over if we want to survive. You have to understand we are in a survival moment. We're not talking about going further with Europe here. We are talking about saving the elite who can make Europe survive, one day more. And just I'll end with this. I mean, look at this palace. When Florence was at the height of its good governance, which was under the Priori, there was no decoration here. None at all. There were no statues, there were no frescoes, because there was nobody to commission this money. The commune was very poor. The priors just had 2 months as terms, and they were not paid. They only had their expenses paid. This is how government worked. When did they started to decorate and make it the beautiful building that you see? Well, when state capture came in, so in other words, under Cosimo I and further on, right? We have to return to at least giving the impression that we are bare, and we are here to serve Europe and solves people problems, or they will replace us with another elite. Don't be surprised, but another elite does exist in Europe, and you will see it coming through these populist parties.
Thank you, Commissioner Navracsics.
I think we definitely have all the resources for keeping the world leading role of Europe. And I break it down in three factors. First, we have to empower or re-empower local communities and communities. The European integration, the technical side of the European integration is very much a top-down process. It's about markets, it's about legislation, regulations. We have to empower local communities, regional communities, to make the European Union a community of communities. Because all the advantages and all the positive impacts of the previous European economic development and civilization came from the local level. The local inventions, the local traditions, local cultures made Europe big, and that's why I think we have to empower again local and regional communities. This community of community conception can help us to make the whole European Union more flexible to face the challenges, to address challenges, and to react to the future economic or even political developments in worldwide, just because a more flexible structure are more adaptable to the ever-changing circumstances. And the third one is we have to harness all the results of the European cultural traditions. We can use all the European inventions, just for example, the cities. Cities are European inventions, as we know it. Universities and free thinking are the components of the European civilization. And that made us and our predecessors able to address those challenges in their time, and it made they made Europe a big power at that time. So I think if we want to see Europe again in a leading role, we have to rediscover the importance of universities, of cities, European civilization, and free thinking, and that's the way we can reform European economies as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are now ready to open to the floor for questions and comments to be addressed to individual speakers or to the panel as such, and we will have about 15 minutes for this, and then the panelists will have a final say. Is anybody there who wants to step forward? I see a gentleman there. I hardly see it though, because...
Thank you very much. I'm Endre Borbat, a researcher from the European University Institute, and this question goes to Tibor Navracsics, Commissioner for Education. I felt very strongly for what you said about cultural integration, the importance of universities rediscovering the freedom of thinking, the importance of universities again. So this question is formulated to you also as a former academic and also as a former leader of Fidesz. What's your take on what we see in Hungary nowadays, which seems to be a deliberative attempt to close down the region, one of the region's most important universities, Central European University? How do you relate this from a European perspective and also from a Hungarian perspective? And what do you think the European Union can do to stop the process which is happening or seems to be happening in Hungary? Thank you very much.
You want to respond right away? Yeah. Yes, sure.
You might met my reactions in the affair of the Central European University. I announced several times that I think the Central European University is one of the main assets of the European higher education area. I think it's very important to keep the Central European University alive. Actually, the European Commission launched an infringement procedure against Hungary in the CEU affair, and we have to wait for the results of the negotiations.
Thank you. Good. Anybody else there? Where? Okay, next. Sorry. This lights here.
Thank you. Just following up on your answer, I would like to ask how probable it is that Orbán Viktor will continue with, or will be successful with his strategy that he's doing at home, like separating the two entities, the two legal entities, saying CEU and Közép-Európai Egyetem are two different things, two different universities. Is the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the EPP aware of this trap?
Well, I can speak only on behalf of the European Commission because I'm the member of the European Commission. I cannot speak on behalf of the European Parliament. You have to ask the representatives of the European Parliament. The European Commission made an investigation in the legislation, in the Hungarian legislation, in several aspects. There is a report on that. For instance, my Directorate General, which is the DG EAC, the Directorate General for Education and Culture, made a report. Education and higher education, both the content and the structure, and all the conditions of the accreditations belong to the exclusive competence of the member states. But the European Commission could launch an infringement procedure on the freedom of services and the free movement of workers on those principles. So now we are launching and we are making that infringement procedures. We have to wait for the official end of the procedure. Other political statements is for the European Parliament, for the EPP.
Thank you. Sure, Roberto.
Social and Democrat political group is very much aware of that. It has taken a very strong public stance supporting CEU and being extremely tough with any action that might undermine its existence and independence. So we also participated to a number of political events always. Moreover, we of course push the Commission to be very vigilant and active in this field.
Are there other questions for the panelists or comments? I don't see anyone. In that case, where? Okay, please, lady there.
Thank you. I'm here on behalf of my students who go on Erasmus programs in terms of vocational colleges and do different exchanges. And I have a question about what is your message? I mean, the Erasmus programs are wonderful programs because the money is very well spent, I want to say it here, because it changes the lives of the individuals who participate with these programs. But my question is, what do you do in terms of reaching those young people besides the educational programs? What is your message or your mission you would talk to young people and reach young people besides education? That's my question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can perhaps start with Commissioner Navracsics about this topic and then come gradually back for you to respond to the other speakers as well and close the session with about 2 minutes each.
Okay, thank you. Just very briefly, for me, Erasmus Plus is not only about education, it's not only about students' mobility, it's about developing a new kind of European identity, a European identity which can be feasible because it's not supersedes national, regional or local identities, but it adds to those identities And that's why I think it is very important. We are negotiating with the member states for the next multi-annual financial framework, and we have very good feedbacks that the member states will support our ambitions to raise the level of financing of Erasmus+, to make it socially more inclusive and of course more easily accessible for those people who at the moment can't afford to take part in Erasmus+, just because I think that's a strategic policy area of the European integration. If we want to have success in economic growth, in employment policy, in all other areas, we have to invest in education, in bringing people closer to each other and making them mobile, and that's Erasmus+ for me.
Thank you. Alina, do you want to come back to some of the issues raised by the other panelists, briefly?
Just a word on the future of Europe scenarios that Jean-Claude Juncker mentioned earlier, where I think he was remarkably candid to say there should have been only one option, you know, but out of courtesy they added the other options there, okay? And they didn't edit all of them, all right? In options analysis, I'm teaching a policy school, you tell students you have to put all the potential options. Nothing should be left out of the alternatives, bad as they are. You know, if there's some bad actor who would put forward a problem, this has to be there. So I think that first problem with the scenarios is that they're not complete. The worst alternatives are entirely missing. The second is, what is actually the problem that we're going to solve? If the problem is a survival game, as I mentioned earlier, then he's absolutely right. The one scenario that he believes is plausible, but it's a survival scenario. It is not a scenario which will solve our earlier ambitions, like all these Mediterranean and Eastern European areas that we roughly contributed to their destabilization while trying, in fact, to you know, promote the European normative principles in our neighborhood. And where would the solution come for this second thing? I mean, first, I think you have to survive. My friend Krastev is right. Survival in times when you're endangered, survival is first thing. First, survive. But second, what do we do with these broadest areas? I think it is our proudest achievement to have stabilized Europe. But I think that if we look at our peripheries now, from Macedonia to Donetsk to Libya, we're not looking good at all, and it's not that one option which would solve this. That simply needs something else.
Irene.
Yeah, I agree with Alina about the complexity that we are in survival mode. I mean, ultimately, one of the things that Europe should be doing, instead of saying more Europe as a mantra, actually trying to understand what are the complexities. And after Brexit and after Trump, we have to think about the unthinkable. And the dissolution of the EU, something that we never want to think about, actually could be a possible scenario. So one of the creative thinking that at least the elites could do, and hopefully the people will follow, is actually drop this rigid one-size-fits-all. Ultimately, if you see EU now, is quite flexible. There are a lot of opt-outs. Some people are part of the euro, some part of the banking union, some are part of NATO, Schengen. So in a way, I think the key is adapt greater flexibility of the network for now. And I agree it's about surviving for the time being, not about advancing at least. And I think in this multi-speed, multi-tier union, at least, they will offer more panoply of weapons to be able to fight what seems to be declining in general. But the last point also, the French elections next Saturday, next weekend, reminds us that ultimately it is about the nations and what decisions they will make. I mean, there is a limit to how much Europe can do. It's the public themselves and what kind of politicians they're going to elect, who are going to endorse or reject that kind of European dream.
Thank you, Irene. Roberto?
Yeah, but indeed it is a union of citizen and member state. And, but it's not only a union of member state. That's the difference. It's also a union of citizens. And that's a dual element of legitimation, which is not symmetric, which of course makes national politics predominant, but still goes beyond that. And so, as the philosopher used to say, Minerva's house flies at dusk. So maybe it would be up for the future historian to really assess what kind of sovereignty, what kind of construction we are. We are not able to do that fully. But I don't think that is just national politics with a bound of a single market as some construction that is not working very well. It's something beyond that, something complex, something which of course has to be based by the building up of a strong European civil society, and then Erasmus is a crucial, a fundamental, is really landmark, but cannot be only for the cosmopolitan side of our citizenship. This is a fundamental instrument, but I don't think that all the Union citizens young will be someone who's going at the university. So this is not just, Europe cannot just be for this sector of society, even it has to grow, it has to become always more important. So it's something more deeper. And we goes back to the fundamental element of our European social model and the need to bring a different balance between a national and European component. I think, again, that it is possible not only to safeguard, but also to relaunch it, and that we are not just in a survival mode, and that we will finally choose not only for the first scenario, which has, by the way, some dynamic, but also for a combination of the scenario, where also the differentiated integration, the multi-tier, is possible, necessary, is useful, but should always be within the Union framework, exactly not to undermine this very concept of the Union citizenship, which is, starts from the member state citizenship, but goes beyond that, and is also as within a framework of a political and institutional system that can work, especially after Brexit, with some element of differentiation within it, but has to be kept as a fundamental framework, of which, of course, member state will always remain fundamental, but it will be build a different balance, which I think what is already happening. And again, probably a future historian will see it more clearly. So it's really a fascinating task, incredible times, difficult challenges, big risk, yes. But also I think the future is of Europe and its integration.
Thank you so much. I think we bringing this panel to a close, and I would hope that you would join me in thanking our 4 guest speakers for their very lively opinions. Thank you very, very much. Okay, we can remove our